Hello, and welcome to episode 120 of the REconomy Podcast, our third episode of this year's summer school series, where we discuss economic issues that impact real estate, housing, and affordability. I am Odeta Kushi, Deputy Chief Economist at First American, and here with me is Mark Fleming, Chief Economist at First American. Hey, Mark. So we spent the first two summer school classes covering demand, first headship rates, and then what's driving and delaying homeownership.
Right. And today we're going to switch over to supply, or as I like to say, today we learn how we built this city, housing edition. Getting into it early.
Oh, a Starship 80s reference and so early in the class. Well done. You really nailed that.
Oh, no. So there's going to be a lot of construction puns clearly in this episode.
I couldn't resist. But back to class. Let's start with the basics as we've been doing. When we talk about housing supply, what are we actually counting?
Well, it is tempting to think of it simply as all the houses that exist, but it's a little more nuanced. We think about it in two big categories. Flow measures like the new housing starts or completions. These show how much new stock is being added. And stock measures, which capture the total number of housing units at any point in time.
And not every unit in the stock is actually available to live in. Some homes are vacant because they're under renovation or maybe uninhabitable altogether. So the headline numbers can really mask what's actually usable. We'll talk about that when we discuss how we quantify the housing surplus or shortage. But first, let's cover construction.
Right. So when people track new supply, we usually look at three stages: permits, starts, and completions. Permits are defined as local government approvals that allow construction to begin. Starts means that a builder has broken ground and started building a home. And completions obviously means that the home is finished and ready to be occupied.
And according to the U.S. Census Bureau's 2024 data, the average time from permit to housing start was 1.4 months for single-family homes. It's a little longer for multifamily properties at about 2.7 months. That average of 1.4 months for single-family homes is down a little from a series high, and that series goes all the way back to 1976. And that high was 1.5 months in 2023, but up from a recent low in 2013 of 0.7 months. Now, from start to completions, the average time for single-family homes was 7.7 months and 16.9 for multifamily. Again, that time for single-family start to completion is down from last year's 8.6 months, but higher than the 2013 average of 6 months.
But it is important to remember that not every permit becomes a start, and not every start becomes a timely completion. Financing issues, labor shortages, or material delays can all slow things down. I'm reminded during the pandemic of not being able to get appliances to finish houses.
Appliances, garage doors, windows, all sorts of issues back then. It's also important to think about this as a supply pipeline. We can have a situation where there are a lot of units under construction and a lot of completions coming to the market, but builders have pulled back on filing for permits and breaking ground on new projects, aka starts. In this example, you could have a short-term oversupply situation followed by an undersupply situation.
That actually sounds a lot like the story in multifamily construction right now. The multifamily construction backlog, which we calculate as the ratio of completions to units under construction, is still elevated, which is indicating that there is a small construction backlog in multifamily at the moment. The headlines last year were all about how multifamily completions were elevated, which means some markets were oversupplied, but permits and starts were trending lower. So once those under construction units are delivered to the market, we could actually find ourselves back in an undersupply scenario if permits and starts don't actually pick up again.
That's a really great point. And when we look at the latest starts and permits data for the multifamily sector and then smooth it a little bit with a moving average, because it's actually a very volatile series, we find that multifamily permits and starts have been trending sideways, suggesting some stabilization in multifamily groundbreaking. But since we're on the topic of home building levels, something I always like to hammer home.
Okay,
I see your face.
Nails, hammers, but I'm going to one-up you here. I cannot resist. MC Hammer, you can't touch this? No?
Is that why you were playing that at the top of the episode before we started recording?
I had to get myself in the mood.
Okay, now that one, I do know that song, but I've got to say that's technically a January 1990 song, so not quite an 80s reference, but I will round up and count it for you.
Thank you.
But really, when we talk about how much we're building and comparing it to historic levels, it's important to look at those numbers relative to the population.
That's right. 1 million housing starts today isn't the same as 1 million housing starts in 1980 because our population is obviously significantly larger today.
That's right. We always have to population inflation adjust. So let's review just how much home building has been done in the past relative to present. We were able to use historical US Census Bureau data to compute the number of total housing starts per 1,000 households all the way back to 1920. And we found some interesting trends.
All right, a construction history lesson, shall
That's
we
right.
say, starting from the very beginning. The average number of housing units constructed per year increased from 247,000 in 1920 to an average of 785,000 between 1921 and 1928. Big increase. This was the building boom of the 1920s, caused in part by a booming economy. In the late 1920s to mid-1930s, building declined, obviously because of the Great Depression. In fact, in 1933, housing starts per 1,000 households was just 3. 3. That's a series low.
Wow, that is very low, but makes sense with the Great Depression being around that time. But by the late 1930s and early 1940s, we were back to building again, anywhere from 500 to 700,000 units a year, which equated to 15 to 20 units per 1,000 households. Then there was a big building boom in the post-World War II 1940s and 50s. In fact, building peaked at 1.9 million units in 1950, or 44 units per 1,000 households. We have never built at this rate since. So consider we went from 3 per 1,000 in the 1933 to 44 per 1,000 households in 1950. That's a pretty big increase.
Yeah, and even the scale, 1.9, we're not even close to that now. And this is like, 60, 70 years later.
Right.
The 1940s and 50s, that was spurred by the GI Bill, which guaranteed home loans with no money down, and construction of the interstate highways. This allowed millions of veterans to buy homes and move out to the newly built suburbs. I'm thinking of that TV show, The Wonder Years.
All right, that's a little bit before my time maybe, but sure. Okay. And then fast forwarding to your favorite decade, the 80s. In the 80s, we were building about 17 units per 1,000 households on average. There was a dip in 1982, which is around when the housing market was struggling from higher interest rates, 18% interest rates around that time. Right. That'll do it. But even in that dip, we were building about 13 units per 1,000 households.
And then from the mid-1980s up until the mid-2000s, we were building on average 15 to 16 units per 1,000 households. At the trough of the global financial crisis correction from 2009 to 2011, we were building just 5 per 1,000 households, which is very close to that Great Depression historical low of 3. And as of 2024, we were building only about 10 per 1,000 households. That's about the same as in 1991. So we've been underbuilding since the trough of the GFC.
There's a lot of different ways to measure the extent of underbuilding. Remember, we discussed stock and flow measures at the top of the episode. Well, the example we just gave could be considered a flow stock analysis, with housing starts being the flow and the number of households being the stock variable. But even when we do a flow analysis, we find that we've been underbuilding for over a decade.
The way we do that flow, stock flow analysis is by comparing new housing units completed to new demand for housing. Refer back to the first summer school session for a thorough explanation of household formation, which is how we define that new demand for housing in this flow analysis.
Right. And this analysis you just mentioned measures the housing deficit by comparing new household formation, both rental and owned, to total new housing units completed and added to the housing stock. And that's completions of single family, multifamily, and manufactured housing. And we account for the replacement of a small fraction of the old stock for obsolescence. We find that on a month-to-month basis in recent years, more households are being formed than homes being completed. And if we pick a point in time when we considered the market to be balanced or normal, then we can even calculate a supply or deficit. This analysis shows us that our housing market has faced a shortage since 2006. But before then, we were actually in a surplus scenario.
So you don't say. In the housing boom of the early aughts, I love the chance to use that term. In the early aughts, we were building more homes than household formation rate supported. Essentially,
Exactly.
Supply excess. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, one more way to measure housing deficit and or shortage. And remember that each one of these methods has some shortfalls and requires some assumptions to be made.
I expect nothing less from two economists.
Indeed. Our last but not least method for measuring the housing deficit is the vacancy rate approach. But let's start by defining vacancy rate. So rental and homeowner vacancy rates, the Census Bureau defines the rental vacancy rate as the proportion of the rental inventory which is vacant for rent. Similarly, for the homeowner vacancy rate, it's the proportion of the homeowner inventory which is vacant for sale.
That's right. And it's reasonable to assume that there wouldn't be a lot of vacant housing stock if there was an overall supply shortage. So using these vacancy rates, we're able to calculate a housing deficit. Just like the last analysis, though, it requires choosing a time when we consider vacancy rates to be relatively normal, meaning a level that we would expect when there is neither a deficit or a surplus of housing. Then we compare that average vacancy rate during the normal period of time to the current vacant housing stock to calculate the surplus or deficit. The normal period we chose for this analysis was 1993 to 2003.
And the deficit as of this quarter of 2025, the first quarter of 2025, is just under 1 million. So 943,000 unit deficit to be precise, which is down from the peak of nearly 2 million units in the second quarter of 2022, but it is still a deficit.
There we go. And let's do some back of the envelope calculations here. In the first quarter of 2025, we were building at a pace of approximately 1.4 million housing units. That's the seasonally adjusted annualized rate. If this rate of building was sustained and there was no, zero, zippo, new household formation, second home sales, or destruction of homes, then we could get back to the historical vacancy rate in a little less than a year.
Okay, well, that doesn't seem very likely. The zero, no, zippo, new household formation, especially given our discussion in our first summer school session about the outlook for household formation in the near term.
Was I a little bit leading with the zero, zippo sort of commentary there?
Maybe a little bit, yeah.
Spoiler alert, it is much greater than zero, so that is not a good assumption to make. Assuming non-zero household formation, the stock of housing will likely be undersupplied for at least the next few years. But to be clear, the supply of housing is not the same as the supply of homes for sale, because homes are a durable good. Once initially supplied as a newly completed constructed home, they can be resold or turned over.
That's a great segue, Mark, because we have created a metric that we call inventory turnover, which looks at the sum of new construction supply and existing homes being put up for sale. In other words, the combination of the supply of new housing and the supply of homes being turned over. Rather than the traditional measures of inventory for sale, it is better when looking at a long historical context to measure the inventory as a share of the total stock, because the overall size of the total stock of homes has grown substantially over the last 30 years, believe it or not. So 2.4 million homes for sale in the 90s, not quite the same as 2.4 million today.
I see a recurring theme here. We've once again inflation adjusted it.
Precisely. We've now repeated this concept of inflation adjusting a few times, so it must be pretty important for the exam.
Whoa, exam? Hold up. We have exams in summer school?
Sorry. No exam. I was taking my professor duties a little too seriously, but let me get back to inventory turnover before I panic the classroom.
Which would be me.
Which would be you at this point.
Yeah.
The pre-pandemic historical average of this inventory turnover measure was 2.5%, or 250 in every 10,000 homes were for sale. Remember, that's new and existing. Today, it's 150 in every 10,000 homes. That's still historically low, but actually higher than the pandemic 2022 low of 106 in every 10,000 homes.
And that improvement is showing up in the price data. Annual house price appreciation is at the slowest rate since 2012, and that's in part due to the increase in the inventory alleviating price pressures.
Very true. But I think it's important to mention that even with the increase in inventory for sale, we're still in a structural housing shortage. Not to mention that inventory buildup is not uniform across the country. We've seen inventory creep up higher in the South, notably in Texas and Florida, while the Northeast and Midwest markets still face a tighter inventory environment. But I guess that begs the question, why can't builders just build more homes? I mean, go to the Northeast and Midwest and just build.
So
right?
Simple, right? They can, and they've tried, but they face the 5 L's, as we say: labor, lots, legal issues, lumber, and lending, which makes it more challenging and costlier to build.
And these are not new. These are ongoing supply challenges stemming from skilled labor and lot shortages, lending issues such as elevated financing costs and tighter credit, rising material costs, and regulatory hurdles that have made it difficult and costlier to deliver more homes.
Yes, you mentioned a few, but builders also face higher financing costs, tariff uncertainty, softer demand due to elevated rates, material costs that are still over 40% higher than the pre-pandemic level, and chronic labor shortages.
That chronic labor shortage in construction has been a challenge for many years. And despite positive gains in residential building construction and remodeling jobs, more is needed. Many construction workers are aging out and have been aging out and retiring from the workforce. And at the same time, the industry is struggling to attract younger generations to careers in the trades.
And on the financing side, according to NAHB's survey on A, D, and C financing, that's acquisition, development, and construction loans that are used by builders, this tightened modestly from the fourth quarter of 2024 to the first quarter of this year, although the reports of tightening were less widespread than they have been at any other time over the past 3 years.
Okay, a little bit of a glimmer there. And then there's all those regulatory costs. Another study from the NHB shows that regulations imposed by all levels of government account for roughly $94,000 or 24% of the average sales price of a new single-family home. That's from a 2021 study, and it actually shows that these costs were up 11% from the last time they did the study in 2016.
And of course, many of these costs are then passed on to the consumer in the form of a higher house price.
Exactly. Now, we mentioned these 5 Ls because more supply is the long-run answer to housing affordability. More homes where people want to live means more choices, which helps temper price and rent growth.
So if we break ground on more homes, then step by step, we'll build the gap between housing demand and supply.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out if that was an intentional 1980s Eddie Rabbit reference or you're just staying step by step.
Of course it was intentional, although I have to admit this is not at the top of my 80s playlist, a little before my formative teenage years. This is where the Google machine definitely helped.
Okay, well, I should have figured I'll never underestimate
Exactly.
your 80s reference abilities again. Okay, well, that actually concludes this episode on tracking housing supply. But don't forget to join us on the next Summer School episode. And as always, thank you for joining us on this REconomy Summer School session. If you have an economics-related question you'd like us to feature in the future, you can email us at economics@firstam.com. And as always, if you can't wait for the next episode, you can follow us on X. It's at Odeta Kushi for me and at Fleming for Mark. Until next time.